Okay, welcome everyone. Just thank you so much for attending our Real Talk Forum. I'm Jeffrey Carroll, and Associate Professor of Political Science and the Chair for the Center for Data and Society. And I'm joined here at the hip usually by my esteemed colleague, Dr. David Contasta, historian, among so many other things. Um, the purpose of the Real Talk Forum, which began in October of 2016, is to provide the community a venue to discuss political events. And the genesis of this began from what was started as weekly conversations between David and myself from all things politics to daily conversations practically, especially now that our offices are across the hall from each other. And also outside of the office, we often give each other a phone call, and especially in times where we are making sense of the world outside of the college. And we share this, the study of American politics and history, albeit from two different perspectives. David, as a historian, is linear, whereas my study is of institutions and how power resonates in it. So with that, we offer this forum today just to give a little bit of recap and some hot takes on the presidential election. And we're trying to figure it out like everyone else about what happened, what's happening, and what's about to come. Okay. Now with that, this time I'm going to start, and I'm going to recap the results. And then I'm going to turn it over to David, who is going to give us a little bit of purview of the Trump presidency. Okay. And then after that, we're going to open it up for questions and just have a dialogue. The electoral votes, 538 electoral votes, 312 electoral votes went to Trump, 226 to Kamala Harris. Donald Trump here takes all the swing states, okay? Swing states such as Nevada and Arizona, Wisconsin and Michigan, and here in our home state of Pennsylvania. There are roughly about 154 million votes cast, which 74.3 million of those votes went to Kamala Harris, 76.8 million to Trump. And it's important to note that they're still counting. So the official vote count hasn't been released yet. So the margin in the popular vote today is roughly about 2.5 million votes. Trump wins the popular vote. And when all said and done, it's probably the slimmest margin since 1888. That's in relative terms about 1.7% points today. It'll probably, with the counting of where the votes are left, a lot of which in California, probably will be 1.6 or even 1.5. It's about 50%, but he's under. It's about 49.9%. So interestingly, right, at least today, Trump is not capturing the majority, but he will, I think, when all of the votes are cast. So depending on who you ask, is it a landslide election? Well, in terms of electoral votes with all swing states going to Trump, maybe so. In popular vote, you can't say that. I think that the consensus so far is that it's not. It was really, really close. Okay. In terms of voter turnout change from 2020, in 2020 we had 158 million votes cast, and once the count is complete, it'll probably mirror that election in terms of turnout. And interestingly, record turnout. There were Republican gains all across the country, and certainly in places that we didn't expect. In Pennsylvania, about 7,032,000 votes were counted. It's about today about the same as 2020. Again, the results still have to be certified. It's very interesting about the region. Important to note that for the first time, the majority of Bucks County went red, voted Republican. In fact, 82% of the precincts in this region that I'm showing you up here, or Philadelphia and the surrounding counties, 82% of precincts shifted towards Trump in some ways, including in Philadelphia. Where it was roughly in 2020 about 13% Trump and Republican, to now what is up over 20%, one of every 5 voters in one of the most democratic, dense places in the United States shifted towards Trump. What issues mattered the most in this election? Well, make it be known for all, whether Democrats or Republicans, we voted with our pocketbooks. We did, all voters. Now, beyond the economy, however, it's important to note it depends, okay? For those Republican leaning, it was immigration and border security, followed by national security, then crime and taxes. For those Democratic and Democratic leaning, this is very interesting. Aside from economy, we have this amorphous idea that we voted in terms of democracy and democratic norms. Okay? After it was climate change, women's and reproductive rights tied to some talk about the Supreme Court that was post-Dobbs, and healthcare. For economy, it's among the highest salience since the Great Recession of 2008. Highest. It's always the top issue in elections, but it's important to note that this election, it was significantly much more so than any other topic by a very, very large margin. So what it means then, it meant more today than it meant in 2020, than it meant in 2016, than it meant in 2012. It was close to resembling 2008, where we elected Barack Obama. I'm going to sum up with some demographic changes in terms of what we're seeing preliminarily in terms of voting and party shifting. Then I'm going to turn it over to David. For Trump and the Republican Party, the campaign doubled down into reaching out towards men. And for all signs point that it worked. It really did. 60% of white men, but the interesting point here is that among men, black men and Latino men, among black men, it's 25% of black men, nearly doubled from 12% in 2020. And 50, and I think when all votes are counted, it'll be between 50 and 60% of Latino men voted for Trump. Trump also picked up a large amount of votes among the youth, among youth voters, okay? 47% of voters 18 to 29, it's up from 36% from 2020, significant gains, and 47% of voters between 30 and 44. That's up 43% in 2020. So again, it's important to note that it's across demographic groups are voting towards the Republican Party and for Trump. Now, conversely, for Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party, so what was different from 2020? Kamala Harris did well, but didn't do as well as President Biden. She had to almost mirror a lot of President Biden's demographics here. So not as well as President Biden in cities and the suburbs. The interesting part is that Trump's gain in rural areas is much larger than 2020. So those two things combined. Harris not doing as well in cities and suburbs, including our own city in Philadelphia, and the margin of Trump doing well in rural areas. And also, Kamala Harris in more educated counties with college degrees. Trump carried a bigger margin without college degrees. So there is a diploma gap here, but the number of gains. And what it looks like is it looks like there was a great amount of first-time voters that may have voted for Trump, and especially with first-time voters without college degrees, which is very interesting. Okay. So I say that to say is that this means that the coalition of people that Democrats usually depends, it had shifted shifted enough. It only has to tweak a little bit to win an election. We're talking 1.6%, so it was enough for Kamala Harris to lose. Okay. So in this victory speech, Trump calls this though he wins a historic realignment. But we have to be careful about that language. And this is not so. Realignment happens when a key demographic group completely defects from one political party to another. This is more signs that there is demographic shifts, maybe signs from potential future realignment, but not to be confused with realignment itself. A lot more to say, but I'll save it for now. Let me turn it over to David. So the main thing is, unlike 2016, Trump is not an unknown. He's very well known. And he ran as an incumbent, almost seeking re-election in this election. And he doubled down on his own style and doubled down on his own politics. So with that, I turn it over to David.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I'm going to talk about a number of things that voters overlooked when they chose Donald Trump, many of which would have disqualified or disrailed any candidate in the past. That is, several of the things that Donald Trump said would have immediately caused voters to turn against him, caused the pundits to say that he had wrecked his campaign and that he had no chance of winning. And I want to try to explain why that's the case after mentioning some of these things. The newly elected president of the United States has boasted about being a very successful businessman, even though 6 of the businesses which he owned or to which he was closely tied went bankrupt. He became famous by starring in a supposed reality TV program called The Celebrity Apprentice that had nothing to do with reality, yet millions of viewers became convinced that the star was a business genius. He used fake names to make phone calls to New York City media to advertise his latest exploits. He created the fake Trump University that had no accreditation, did not give grades, and did not award diplomas or certificates. Sued for fraud, he settled out of court for $25 million. Just before the 2016 presidential election, he bragged on the Access Hollywood tape, "When you're a star, they'll let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by their genitals," although that's not what he said. He used another term. You can do anything. For years, he lied in questioning Barack Obama had been born in the United States. The Washington Post newspaper counted over 30,000 false or misleading claims that he made during his first presidential term. He used projection to defend himself against charges of lying. He was not lying. The fake news, as he called the mainstream press, was lying. He called his political opponents vermin and said immigration was poisoning the blood of the United States, echoing language used by Hitler against those whom he considered undesirable people and whom he would later try to wipe out completely. He said that those who had served in the military were suckers and losers. As remedies for COVID, he recommended injecting powerful and deadly cleaning agents into the body. He wanted to use the Insurrection Act of 1807 to call out regular military troops against protesters, but was talked out of it by his military advisors. In January 2016, he boasted, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any voters." He urged supporters at his rallies to rough up protesters and said he would pay their legal bills if they did so. Although he clearly and definitively lost his bid for re-election in 2020, as measured both by the popular vote and the electoral vote, a conclusion supported by 60 federal judges, many of them Republicans, he orchestrated an armed attack on the U.S. Capitol to reverse the results of the election and stay in power. It resulted in vicious assaults on Capitol Police and 4 deaths and in life-threatening danger to Vice President Pence. He was impeached twice by the House of Representatives, but not convicted by the Senate. The first time for making $400 million in aid to Ukraine contingent on their investigating President Biden's son. The second time was for orchestrating that deadly assault on the Capitol building in an effort to overturn a presidential election that he clearly lost. He was indicted by 2 federal grand juries. One was for the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, and the other was for illegally taking classified documents at the end of his presidency to his home at Mar-a-Lago in Florida and refusing to turn them over to the National Archives in clear violation of the Presidential Records Act of 1978 and 2018. He is yet to be tried in either case, partly thanks to the Supreme Court of the United States that says that the president is immune for official acts while in office. A criminal court in New York City found him guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records in order to cover up a sexual relationship with a porn star. He is yet to be sentenced. He's not going to be sentenced because he was elected president of the United States. In a New York City civil trial, he was found guilty of sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. All these facts are just the tip of the iceberg, and as I said, almost any one of them would have disqualified someone and would have wrecked the person's campaign. One would have every reason to conclude that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, who created our constitutional system of government just down the road in Independence Hall, you could walk there if you wanted to, it's about 10 miles away, would be shocked and appalled if they could have foreseen someone like Donald Trump, but maybe not Delegate Benjamin Franklin. On a mid-September day in 1787, and Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia noticed Delegate Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention and reportedly asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin quips, "A republic if you can keep it. A republic if you can keep it." Franklin may have said such a thing because he knew that the main goal of the convention was to create a more powerful central government with a powerful chief executive at the helm. Franklin also knew that the delegates had just provided the president with essentially the same powers that then belonged to the crowned heads of Europe, which would probably surprise many Americans today. However, the convention delegates thought they could restrain abuses of these awesome powers through a system of checks and balances. Unfortunately, many of these checks and balances have proven ineffective over the years and for various reasons, which I have addressed in earlier installments of Real Talk, which I will not repeat here. But impeachment is a dead letter. It simply never worked because the party of a president being impeached will not vote to convict that person. And this happened with Donald Trump twice. Still, the question remains as to how so many voters could ignore the above recitation of Donald Trump's behavior in casting ballots in 2024. One answer comes from a recent book that I just read called The Drama of Celebrity by Sharon Marcus. In it, she discusses what she calls defiant celebrities, defiant celebrities. They not only appeal to the marginal and the outcast, but to anyone who has ever wanted to bypass conventions, gatekeepers, or experts. And she gives many examples of defiant celebrities. One of them is the actress Sarah Bernhardt. I know there's Oscar Wilde. You have bank robbers Bonnie and Clyde in the early 1930s. People were applauding them and thought they were wonderful for shooting up banks and so forth. And then we have James Dean in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, and even Elvis the Pelvis Presley, who was seen by many as one of these kinds of celebrities. And also the Beatles with their then unconventional grooming and dress and lyrics of such songs as "Do What You Want to Do." Although people voted for Trump for many reasons, as Jeffrey told us, his bad boy behavior probably had appeal to a lot of them. That is, Trump gave voters permission to say what they wanted to say and to gleefully insist that no one was going to tell them what they could do or not do, especially if it came from well-educated elites on the two coasts of the United States, whom they often thought were mocking them and whom they believed had too much power over American life and culture. And that's a real problem, by the way, that needs to be addressed by the Democrats. And it did not seem to matter to them that they had little in common with a billionaire from New York City. But they did because he shared their contempt for proper speech and behavior, and he admired contempt for social conventions, which allowed him to say or do whatever he liked. Then there's the possibility that even though Trump has said so many things that would have sunk any other candidate in the past, potential voters may have simply said, "Oh, that's just Trump. He doesn't really mean it. That's the way he talks." And there was a kind of a fire hose of this. It was hard really to keep track of the things that he was saying. Then there's the problem that Americans now get their news through silos, that is made up of their favorite cable news channels or their favorite social media sites. And because of algorithms, they're going to be fed the same thing over and over, over and over, over and over. Whether all these circumstances will become a permanent fixture in American politics is too early to tell. Thanks.
It's a lot to unpack here. A lot of real talk now, right?
Yeah, a lot of real talk now.
Shall we open it up?
Yeah.
Take a minute to digest some of what was said here, and just know that in a lot of ways that we are always trying to figure it out. I think that has been the long-running theme in our conversations, right, David, is that we have no answers.
We do what we don't.
We do, but we don't. History has really pointed to what the possibilities can be, but what we've really grappled with, I believe, is the complete overturning of norms. They are just so different today in so many ways that are doing everything we can to come to grips with those changes in norms. Just the fact that I think the biggest thing that I took away from your points, David, there's one part where you said things that happened today in terms of events and what's said would completely have you discredited, and you would have been completely booted out and ostracized from the political process. Not just even withstanding an election, the entire process would have booted you out. And here we are, we've doubled down if we accepted them. And how could it be that we've had these established norms for so long, and then just over these last 8 years, they don't matter anymore? So what's really going on? So I think that's really one of my biggest takeaways.
And one of the things that the framers of the Constitution talked about was virtue, that the President of the United States should be a person of virtue, that is, who followed established norms and mores and so forth. This is something that also concerned Alexander Hamilton. They just assumed that the president wouldn't be a liar. They just assumed that the president wouldn't have a foul mouth and say obscene things and bear false witness against others. They knew human beings weren't perfect, but they hoped that whoever's in this august office would show restraint. And the word republic, which comes from the Latin res publica, means things in the public good, things for the public good, not for the good of the candidate, not for the good of the president or whatever. And I just think we've lost sight of it. That tape where he said he could grab women by you-know-what would have disqualified anybody immediately. The person would have lost by a landslide. It's still inconceivable that he was able to get away with that.
Right. I remember we responded to that because our first real talk was the week after that. Okay. And we've been known for elections to have these things that happen in October, a couple of weeks before the election. They're called the October surprise. And when they do happen, they filter through the media, especially when it relates to scandal. It can really completely derail the campaign. And we were saying, I think we said this. He's done. That's it. That's it. Yeah, so there were so many things that we had to really square away. That didn't matter at all. Really, that didn't matter at all. It actually, the October surprise ended up when we look back at it, we thought it was that. No, it was Hillary Clinton's emails ended up being the bigger thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the economy also flummoxes me. The President of the United States has very little control over the economy, almost none. The fact that there was inflation had to do with the aftermath of COVID. It had nothing to do with the Democrats. The economy is so huge and immovable that no president really has much control over it. I don't think the immigration question is very well understood either. If we threw out all the immigrants, we'd be in a horrible shape economically in this country, besides the fact that a lot of injustice is going to be done to a whole lot of people. So I just think that voters often don't understand the issues.
They don't, but unlike 2016, we know who we have today. The tone is very different in that we've had 4 years to know that the politics of disjunction, the hardball politics of rewarding your friends, the people that are going to be loyal, and changing those institutions to replacing the people that we're putting in to govern us, and the powerful are the ones that are going to be loyal, not necessarily, if not any, the ones with the expertise. It's who's not going to give me a problem, right?
Well, there's the whole MAGA phenomenon. People not holding anything against him, thinking he could do wrong. He's a martyr, too. He's even compared himself to Jesus on a couple of occasions, particularly during the Easter season. He was spared of being killed by that gunshot because God had saved him. A lot of people see him as a martyr, that he's being persecuted by the press, so that you have all that in addition. And there's also the Republican Party. Back in 1974, the Republican Party wouldn't put up with Richard Nixon. In fact, Barry Goldwater, who was one of the most conservative Republicans at the time, went over to the White House and told Nixon he's going to be impeached, he's going to be convicted, and he ought to resign. There weren't any moderate Republicans this time who were willing to go over to the White House and to face Donald Trump. They're afraid of him. And it's too bad that people think the only thing they can do in life is get reelected and reelected and reelected, that they have nothing else going for them. But why don't we throw it open to questions and comments? Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how much Kamala Harris being a woman played into the results, especially among various voting populations? Thanks.
Well, I think that the men thing is part of it. I think a lot of men would say, I'm not going to have some damn woman tell me what to do. That is, certain kinds of men would react in that kind of way. And I think there also is a sense that some people, even women, thought a woman cannot keep us safe. We need to have a strong man who can keep us safe against our foreign enemies, who can keep us safe against criminals in this country. And she's just a woman, and she can't do those things.
Right. I think just especially in terms of certain issues being on the table, especially with reproductive rights, and how would that play out among the conservative voters that are also women? And there seemed to signal a shift in October that the Trump campaign doubled down on saying that Trump wouldn't sign a national federal abortion ban. That, and coupled with a lot of, in those swing states, the issue being a part of at vote, the reproductive rights issue, abortions being at on the ticket, made for, let's just say, a very complicated situation where what it seems like, I'm not sure if this is, the history is going to show, and the science is going to play out over these next decade for sure, but it could say, okay, well, this issue for me, that if it's on the ballot and I get to vote on this issue, and it might take it off the table, and they're running the federal abortion ban, maybe it would lighten it, that it would be able to consider the other issue. But with all of that being said, I think that it's really important to impress about the glass ceiling, that it's very real. And the patriarchal society that we have is especially real. And I think that history is going to show that this was a humongous setback, just in terms of the possibility of a woman being a president of the United States. And we're going to have to unpack that.
Some of you remember Chris Matthews. Of course, he's associated with the college. Chris Matthews asked Donald Trump if a woman should be punished for having an abortion, and he said, yes, she should be punished. So now he's flipping around and saying he's not going to sign a national abortion ban. I don't think we'll get these kinds of contradictions. And at one time, he was in favor of choice. He's been all over the map with all kinds of things. Now, I understand that most people are making living and a hard time getting along, and they're worried about their families and their jobs, and they can't keep track of all these kind of contradictions, and they may, in fact, be involved in a channel or some kind of social media where they wouldn't even hear about these things. Anything else? Yes. Yes.
I have two questions,
Right.
comments. One is the polls were just so wrong.
I know.
And why? And does it relate to the fact, and I'll say it this way, I'm a Democrat, and in the primary I voted for Biden. And then all of a sudden that vote was negated by the Democrat politicians and said, Joe can't win, so we got to give you Kamala Harris. Do you think that had something in there also?
It may have, and the problem was, and I blame Biden for this, he should have said 2 years ago that he was not going to run again and decide to pull out just 3 months before the election. Now, there could have been some attempt to rev up the primaries again. I don't know how that could have been done. And Biden hadn't been actually before the convention and nominated. So yeah, that was a mess. Jeffrey.
It was a mess, and it hurt significantly. It hurt the campaign. Now, in one respect, it is a bit miraculous that Harris ran as well a campaign as she did. This was incredibly close. Regarding the polls, the margin of error is usually about 4%. If you think about how the polls at 4% swinging either way, that's a landslide election for either Trump or Harris. So, but the interesting part is that as far as how it broke down in terms of its demographic groups, it got that right. So when we able to see how certain men, like minority men, were going to vote. And I think that was very telling. Now, interestingly, Kamala Harris couldn't separate herself out from the Biden presidency. She's vice president of the United States. And as much as she was trying to pivot away from Biden, people were, of course, associating her with the incumbent president. And I think that in the end, it hurt her. we weren't able to have a national conversation about what the next who it could be. She wasn't really battle tested in the way of somebody that was underwent a very fierce primary and an exchange of ideas. And then I think at the end it really did cost.
Of course, she was over a barrel because Trump would say, well, you were in the White House for 3 years. Why didn't you do anything? She wasn't president of the United States. She didn't have the power to do anything, but people fell for that also, it seems to me. You had a second question? No?
You had a third question
Okay.
too, but that's
All right.
someone else.
I have a question. We've gone over this, and we can, and we look at the people that voted and how they voted. My question is, short of looking at the primaries in 2 years, what recourse do we have in the sense that the 3 branches of government at this point are pretty well moving to the right? And now you also have Elon Musk and Ramswamy in some position as co-presidents almost. What do we look at that's hopeful?
Well, there are no checks and balances at this point because the Democrats, the Republicans control the White House and both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. And I don't think the Supreme Court's going to come down on anybody or anything. And in fact, some of the Supreme Court justices who are getting up in years and have been thinking about retiring are going to retire now so that Trump can appoint people who will be agreeable to him. So the Supreme Court's not going to change or do anything. And I talk about this in the book I'm writing about the presidency. The checks and balances haven't worked well from the very beginning because of partisanship. And the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were against political partisanship. And yet from the very beginning, this becomes a problem, that is, members of Congress of the president's own party usually aren't going to stand up against him. And I doubt that that's going to happen now, particularly since Republicans are terrified of crossing Trump in any way. Now, there may be some federal judges who will stand against things that are considered to be illegal or counterproductive or bad or unconstitutional. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. So I don't think there are any checks and balances right now. Jeffrey.
It's difficult to answer this question without having an alarmist tone, but perhaps it necessitates that we have an alarmist tone. Given when you think about the erosion of our institutions, the lack of checks and balances, and as we noted, and what was the theme of our talk on October 25th, is that we have been on this long walk back of democratic values in our country. And we have to be honest and to say, this is not working. To be honest about that. To those in the room, especially to those like myself that care about rights, it's inherently tied, the democratic values part about rule of law, those ideas about being heard, the rights and freedoms, the push towards political equality, and those tenets such as things like justice and diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. It is that there is a doubling down that we have made those democratic values and in turn by proxy, those rights secondary. Okay, so it's more than any election. However, it's this erosion over time that has been punctuated by this election, and here we are. I have much to say about that erosion, but on the hopeful part, especially, I'm looking around to students, some of my students in the room, and to the student leaders that are organizers on campus and so forth, that we're not hopeless, because remember that the things that it's embedded to us on the individual level, right? Notwithstanding who's in power out there, that we have a right to petition and that we can have forums like this because we live in a free-ish country. that we're able to speak our mind, and that what I would offer you all is to know, to double down, that if you do care and these issues mean something to you, especially those that care about things such as human rights, okay, voting is not enough. Voting is one institution of many. How many of us participate within the political process of more than just voting? That means contacting our elected officials, joining an interest group, joining your local political party, knocking on doors, grassroots organizing, engaging, starting a social media campaigns. Our country has been built on the back of this kind of activity. Activist activity, and by young folks. And that, with that, it gives us a lot of hopes. But in doing that, the preparation is just to understand what it is to look power in its face when it necessitates that, and be honest about it. To say, there's slippage here. There has been erosion. Aside from voting, what could we do?
I think there's another thing I talked about it the last time. There's this partisan divide that's so deep and strong in the past, and I think of Lyndon Johnson. He was able to get the Civil Rights Act passed with Republican votes, with liberal Republicans. And at that time, there were liberal and moderate Republicans, there were liberal and moderate conservative Democrats and so forth. And they often crossed the aisle, and people didn't think that someone who belonged to the opposition party was an awful person, a despicable person, someone you couldn't speak to, someone you hated, and so forth. Now the parties have become more rigidly ideological, and that's become a real problem. And it's being reinforced by social media. People said social media is going to be the most wonderful thing. It's going to open up all these different voices, and people are going to have different points of view. No, it's done the opposite in many cases, and so is cable news. I mentioned this the last time. When there were just 3 television networks, I know that was a long time ago, on their news programs, they didn't dare go too far to the right or the left, or they would lose viewers and sponsors. As soon as cable news comes along, they begin to specialize in being right-wing or left-wing and so forth, and then people only watch them, and they only tune in to social media accounts that are going to reinforce what they already believe. And of course, we all have selective perception in that way. And then there's cognitive dissonance that I talked about. Anything I read off here that I would have told someone who was for Trump would have discounted it, said it's lies, it's something the opposition party is saying, I don't believe it because it doesn't conform with what I already believe. We all do that, by the way. We all have a tendency to consume information that reinforces what we already believe.
I apologize for coming late. You may have already addressed this, but do you think, had the Democrats chosen a different vice presidential candidate, for example, Josh Shapiro, that the outcome would have been different? Maybe Democrats would have taken Pennsylvania, for example?
I don't think it would have mattered. I don't think it would have mattered at all.
And I don't think Josh wanted it, because I think he wants to run for president. And if he became VP, then he'd be trapped in an administration, and vice presidents often have a very hard time of becoming president because of this very matter. So I doubt it.
And Tim Walz was very well liked among supporters, so it wouldn't have mattered. There have been very few times in which the choice of a VP candidate has actually thrown the question to the presidency itself, and that last time was the John McCain picking Sarah Palin. There was some things that were around that there was questions of whether if he picked someone different than Sarah Palin, whether it would have played out differently. Even with that, I would have said no. Obama won that in a landslide.
Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question. Yes, as a student here at Chestnut Hill College, as a woman, and as a small business owner, is there anything positive that you could tell me that I could look for now that the election has happened? Okay, is there anything that I can smile about, or you can tell me that will benefit the school, myself as a student, and a woman, and as far as being a small business owner.
One of the problems and the issues of why we often operate in fear when we talk about politics is that it's become nationalized, Kim, meaning that we think about the bigger, broader issues and that the main faces such as Trump being all of politics, when there's another expression that politics is local. And it's really the small things, those really small things that are that we can always opt into, like I mentioned, in participating into our process. There's wonderful, so many great things that are here in the city of Philadelphia. Now, some real fights, as you know, we discussed some of those in class, but nonetheless, just being able to trying to drill down and participate and let ourselves ask the question, what's my role in it? Now, if you're feeling helpless about that role and those things about how to participate to get taken away, then that's a broader conversation. But you think just on drilling down on what is the local participation, the regular interactions that you have with people on your street, in your neighborhoods, the people next to you, forums like this, it actually happens at that level, and that's where the hope comes from. Okay.
I thought you were going to sing the Mr. Rogers song there for a minute, but one of the reasons why we don't pay a lot of attention to local issues is because local newspapers are folding and disappearing all over the place. The Philadelphia Inquirer looks like a little county newspaper today, and almost all the international news they get from the wire services. And what the newspapers, local newspapers, used to cover is, what about the potholes? What about the schools? What about the roadways and all that kind of thing? And so we've nationalized everything and get these horrendous fights. Now, your question about education. Will Trump abolish the Department of Education? I don't know whether he will do that. I'm worried about tax policies. I don't think that taxes are going to be cut significantly for middle-class people. They may well be cut for wealthy people, again, which is going to add to the debt. And both parties are guilty of this. They scream about the debt, and then they get in and they spend like crazy. So it's difficult to say.
Just to respond to that, I want to reiterate what Jeffrey said. It is so important to be involved locally.
Yes, it is.
Your local township, your local council, wherever you live, it affects you so much more than all of this over here. And so if you get involved in the local, you have a say in what's going on in your life around. And I just think that's really important for everyone to hear.
Get involved in the school board, get involved in
Yes.
the county offices and the township.
Local zoning, I mean, all those things really affect you. I guess my question's another one, though. I really have a problem with legislators that have been there 50 years or 40 years. Why is there not term limits? Because I think when our forefathers wrote the Constitution, it was not for a career in the legislature, it was for elder statesmen.
Well, in 1789, when the Constitution went into effect, average life expectancy was 35, okay? And now it's practically 80. That doesn't mean everybody dropped dead at 35, but you had a lot of people dying young and a handful of them living on. And you talk about the Supreme Court. They served for life. In the first decades of the Supreme Court, the average length of time on the court was 8 years. Now they're serving 20, 25, 30 years into their 80s and 90s and so forth. The Senate, by the way, was meant to be older folks because you have to be 30. The word Senate, by the way, is related to the word senile and senior. They're connected to the same thing. There would have to be a constitutional amendment to put term limits or age limits, but that wasn't an issue then because people didn't live that long.
Our representation structure is changing in, I think, a really good way. It's become more diverse and across gender lines and across race, which is really great, but it's happening slowly. It's happening slowly because the advantages of those people that are incumbents, they still are able to mount a campaign for re-election. They're really, really difficult to boot out. So there are advocacy programs throughout the country of grooming people to run for office, for example, but it's happening just such at a slow clip So I just encourage, especially to the young folks in the room, if you're thinking about public service, maybe running for office isn't for you. I know it, looking around in some of the room, I'm like really hoping some of you will, because it's kind of the getting that different kind of energy and how you're able just to shape the conversation. It just happens on the backs of youth. It's a wonderful, beautiful sentiment to see youth around the table, and it just completely shifts because of the presence of that new, fresh ideas, right? It's incredibly daunting, but if you can just throw your hat in the ring and be persistent. And we've even had several of our former alums that they've gotten elected in this past election. So it's really great.
I'd like to throw a fly in the ointment, Jeffrey. Because of the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, I think it's a 2015 case, you can give unlimited amounts of money to campaigns, and even some congressional campaigns are resulting in the expenditure of obscene amounts of money, millions of dollars. And so if you want to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, you'd better get some fat cats to shovel millions of dollars your way, and then you're, yeah, and then you're going to be obliged, to them, and you're going to spend most of the time in the House of Representatives going into a certain office and on the phone begging for money. So the wonderful Supreme Court has given us some wonderful decisions. I'm being sarcastic. This is one of the worst. Another question or comment? Yes, Michael.
If we were political hacks, and I'm not necessarily saying we're not political hacks, just to be clear, but if we were being paid by the major political parties to give advice on how to win the next presidential election, what did we just learn from this election?
Well, I'll just take that. I think that the Democrats, who used to be the party of blue-collar workers and union people and so forth, have become the party of well-educated people on the two coasts, and they've lost out on that constituency. There's a really interesting article in Atlantic Magazine this week about how the Ivy Leagues have ruined American politics. And the thesis is, well, I won't go on and on. In the old days, in the 1890s and so forth, you got into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton and so forth because your family was socially prominent and rich. Didn't matter whether you were a dumb kid and got bad grades and so forth. And then James Conant at Harvard decided in the 1930s that it was going to be based on merit and competitive examinations. But it's still not really fair because rich families have the money to put their kids into cram schools and so forth and get them into these institutions. And David Brooks wrote it, and he said, some of these kids from these wealthy families, for whatever reason, had more of a sense of noblesse oblige, that is, concerns about people who were not as well off, that was sort of inbred in them. And now there's this kind of a snooty elitism. I know this. I went to Harvard. I went to Yale. I went to Princeton. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, and so forth. I don't believe entirely what Brooks is saying, but I think the Democratic Party has to broaden its base. It's really lost a lot.
Michael, thank you for the question, and it's a wonderful question, and it's one I think that we're going to be studying for a very, very long time. A very long time. I think that I concur with David's sentiments is that there was that to win a presidential election, if I could back up to the Electoral College here, you have to put together a cross-section of the American citizens that are most likely that are going to vote, right? And this will change depending on that coalition. And what President Obama did was put together for the Democratic Party what was called the Blue Wall, this Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Biden was able to put some of that back, but what does that look like again for 2028? Is that possible again, and who could possibly do that? Who could closely put together a viable coalition. And with this large, it really was defection of men away from the Democratic Party. How would you take defection of men with college degrees and without, and across geographies? That's an open question about what that may look like. And also too, with states that are very, very changing, such as my home state of Texas, that might be a swing state in 2028. So this is a very, very difficult question about the remake of parties. But with that, I think it can be said, Trump politics and its right and its populism isn't an anomaly. This election put a stamp down into history, right? He wins the popular vote, and it really put a solidification on that, right? In ways that before the election we were talking about this anomalous point in time. We can't say that anymore, I don't think.
There's just a couple of things. The crazy electoral college, which is totally undemocratic, because the founders down at Independence Hall didn't trust common people to select the president of the United States, partly because there was not good transportation and communication. There was no way that people could be informed. And of course, women couldn't vote, and black people couldn't vote, and people without property couldn't vote. And over time, we have made a more democratic system. But the electoral college skews things because candidates only go to those states that are swing states, and they ignore every place else. There's also something peculiar about this country. Many other countries have elected women as prime ministers, as presidents, and so forth, and we can't seem to manage it. And I'm not sure what it is about the United States that's different. In parliamentary systems, it's easier for women to become prime ministers because if they're involved in their party and they go up the ranks in their party, they're automatically going to be prime minister if their party wins. But there's something peculiar about the United States, and I don't know what it is.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that, David, because I think that today Trump, it's a response to this global authoritarianism, anti-cooperation. And if you look at some of the elections this year, the incumbent, they've lost. So it is almost that our tolerance over time for the incumbent is lessened, meaning that we may have the shift of presidents 4 years, 4 years, 4 years. I think that even if we elected every 2, because given midterms, we know there's not this, it just seems so fickle compared to the past that even the potential for reelection, Trump can't serve anymore given the term limits, but even the potential for the reelection is less so now because citizens, I mean, we have less memory for one, but we're really willing to try. We want to overturn the entire power structure and really quickly because is this the right word to use or maybe not? Desperate in a way that we want to see these problems solved, right? Yeah.
And this is what happens when people are unhappy and they're frightened. They think they need a strong person to come in and clean up everything. And Sinclair Lewis wrote a very telling novel in 1935 called It Can't Happen Here. That is, it can't happen in the United States. And there's this US senator who's challenging Franklin Roosevelt for a second term in 1936. And he's written a treatise that's sort of like Mein Kampf, interestingly enough. And his wife, Dorothy Parker, had been a journalist in Nazi Germany and was kicked out. And there have been various other people who talk about the appeal of the strong man. Mussolini's a strong man. Mussolini often went around not wearing a shirt, and Putin does that too, riding on horseback and so on. I'm not sure that that's going to be Trump's case, riding on horseback without a shirt, but he comes across as a tough guy. He's a strong guy. I'm going to beat the hell out of these people, and I'm going to do whatever it takes, and so forth. And he admires Putin, he admires Orban, he admires Kim Jong-un, who's his good buddy. I think there's a piece of him who really admires people. And there are some people who think if you just have a strong person in your clean house, democracy's messy, this is the way to go.
This is not a question so much as an observation. Catholic Church has shifted to the right, just like the right shift you're seeing. You know, people like us are well in the minority. And I have the unusual perspective of hearing confessions and people confide in me. I'm not supposed to break the seal of confession, but I will tell you, I cannot count the number of people who came to me in confession and said, Father, forgive me, I hate the Democratic Party. I hate Joe Biden. I hate Kamala Harris. Pope Francis has what's called a seamless garment theology, which is we're not supposed to look at the life issue as the only issue. We're also supposed to look at poverty, we're supposed to look at, you know, the needs of immigrants and all that sort of thing. But the right has condemned Pope Francis and said, he's evil. And then you have organizations such as the Pennsylvania Catholic Conference in Harrisburg, which is a lobbying group that publishes a list of who you're supposed to vote for. And the church policy is you can't tell people who to vote for, but the Pennsylvania Catholic Conference made it clear you can't vote for Kamala Harris. So it's just an observation.
Well, and Chris, as you know, Catholics were on the out. They were in a minority. There was terrible discrimination against them in the past. They tended to be Democrats and so forth. And we've had episodes of hate groups in the past. The Know-Nothings who attacked Catholics and burned churches in the 1830s and 40s. The Ku Klux Klan seems to rear its ugly head again and again after the Civil War in the 1920s with the Civil Rights Movement, and they're still around. There is this aspect of American culture of hate groups. We don't like people who are different. We don't like immigrants. We don't like Catholics. We don't like Jews. We don't like black people, and so forth. And I'm not saying this is what this election is about, but part of that has come to the fore.
Right. Now, I think we've noted this in other forums that we really should pay attention at the rise in incidents of hate in the last 8 years. What's that correlated with, and why now? And it certainly is trending in the wrong way. And for those that care about rights, what's to be done about this?
Every time this occurs, there is anguish. The economy is bad. People think, and there's this wonderful book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and she talks about how many people in this country have seen that what makes them special is that they're white. And if they're threatened by the idea that this country is going to become mainly non-white in 10 years or so, it really horrifies them, and they're afraid they're going to be persecuted and treated badly themselves. And the predictions are by 2040 to 2050, most people in this country are not going to be white people. And this is what the whole Jim Crow thing was about after the Civil War. Enslaved people get freed. Even poor whites, though, are saying, well, at least I'm a white person, and that means that I'm special. And now this specialness is going to be taken away. And I think that's part of what's going on now.
I have a quick question. Can you talk about the Independent Party? I get a lot of questions in my class of, I'm not necessarily Democrat, I'm not necessarily Republican, but I'm in the middle. And does my vote really matter?
Well, most independents vote one way or the other. They lean one way or the other. They're not really independents. Third parties are really a menace, though. People think they're being noble to vote third party. It's a wasted vote. It's a vote thrown away, and it's going to tend to throw the election one way or the other. The last time a third party became a major party was in 1860, when the Republican Party emerged as a major party, and I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Right. I think that there's the third party, right, such as a third party like the Green Party that's really attentive to climate and environmental issues is different from an independent, which means that you have no affiliation towards a political party. So you're not registered in one party or other, which actually complicates things in a place like Pennsylvania, because if there's a primary, here we have a system called a closed primary that you can't vote in the primary because you're not associated with one of the major parties. But with that, there's an increase, particularly among young people, into being an independent, and there's a fair amount of research in this. A lot of that, what's driving that is not just antipathy towards the two major political parties, the fact that they're really standoffish in just wanting to talk about the political system, and being independent allows you with some kind of with a protection to that, which makes for a very interesting dynamic among our students, our young folk in the room, because I think that there's a possibility for the viability of a major third party emerging possibly in decades to come, because you have this dynamic among Gen Z where they're hyper engaged and civically engaged. And there are a lot of reasons why that may be the case, because there's social media generation and it can't get off their news feeds, and because their parents are involved, et cetera. But the interesting part is that, but they're not tied to any particular political party. So they're like politically engaged, but kind of towards the process a little standoffish. And I think that our views of the party and what that means, it kind of creating that party independence.
I think, though, that third parties don't do well in a system like our own. They work better in a parliamentary system. So if you have a third party and they get 20% or 25% of the votes, and there has to be a coalition government of some sort, then they're going to have a say. And then maybe they're able to build the numbers that they have. In our system, particularly with the Electoral College, that's going to be very difficult. Another thing Jeffrey and I have talked about is civics education is sort of pitiful in the schools these days. Many of them don't even teach it, so that people don't have a sense of what the government's about and how it works and what makes it up. And I don't think we're teaching history very well either in the schools. History and civics, I think, need to make a comeback.
I can't impress David's point more that there are colleagues that I've met across the country in which the most basic curriculum related to history, and particularly some topics like racial history, is considered divisive content that cannot be taught in certain school districts, given that banning books. What the implications of that can be is, it seems intentional. It's purposeful attempt to kind of strip that awareness of folks, from folks in the citizenry about the dark side. We have a very, very dark and violent history of the United States. But if you understand that part, it almost is very predictive about where America has gone and what it's going to be.
Yeah, 4 of our presidents have been assassinated. Half dozen more have been shot and hit. Some others have been shot at and not hit. That's a very poor record when you're talking about heads of states in various countries. And we really celebrate violence. I think it goes all the way back to killing Native Americans, the movies that celebrate gunfights at the OK Corral, and so forth. And maybe this is part of what's going on now. Trump is macho man. He's tough. He tells it like it is. He curses if he wants to. He says obscene things if he wants to. He's a regular guy. And he can curse and swear and say awful things about women and so forth. I think we have a gun problem, a violence problem, a sexist problem in this country. And maybe we've gone far enough. I don't know. Another question or not? Yes.
Any other questions?
I'm not sure how to put this into a question, but understanding that culture and social media obviously plays hand in hand with perception of what the American culture is, and understanding that Western culture is very, very different from like all the other different cultures, like collectivism culture, communal cultures, and all of that. And it's just interesting to see that individualistic culture is very big, obviously, you know, like the American freedom, the American dream, all of that stuff. So understanding how that also plays with immigration. How do you think that impacted this election in general? Because when it came down to it, at least some of my peers and on social media, because at the end of the day, I guess I am Gen Z, And a lot of people voted basically for what impacted them the most, and that could be for a variety of reasons. And to me, I feel like it's because of like individualism and collectivism and just different peoples and immigrants coming here and kind of like living that duality of the two cultures. Just in general, like how do you think that impacted the election this year?
Well, my son's been living in Tokyo for the last 10 years, and he loves it. And he's not going to be shot and killed in Japan. Only 7 people in the entire country were shot and killed by guns last year. When I was visiting him there, I noticed there were a lot of bicycles in Iraq, none of them locked. And I said, why not? He said, no one would steal a bicycle here. If he or she did and were caught, it would be a disgrace to the family, to the 4th generation. They have a very homogeneous culture, but they don't like immigrants in Japan. There's no way you can become a citizen there. It's a very homogeneous culture, pretended to be a homogeneous culture anyway. And people are much better united with each other. And I saw little kids on the train going to school, to nursery school, and I said, why would you allow some little kid? John said, no one would hurt a child here. And if a child needed directions or help, it would be there right away. So yeah, we do have this individualistic culture. I'm gonna do what I want. No one's gonna tell me what to do. No educated snob from some place is going to tell me what to do. The government's not going to tell me what to do, and so forth. So yeah, I think there's something to that, the heterogeneous culture, which is a good thing, but it also can be difficult.
And I think this is such a great question. Oh my gosh. I think that it's just important to understand that we have such a tremendous amount of contradiction in our society, don't we? So in the same breath that we can take and talk about freedoms and rights and values for the individual, we would rebuke all kinds of wonderful collectivist values and then call them communists to boot on top of that. We could say in the same breath, liberty, justice for all, but at the same time, when it comes to thinking about opening doors for diverse populations, we shun them. So the thought of individualism, we have gotten to the point that we really have to unpack just what that looks like today. How is it, what is the image of that? And how is that even the image of the American dream as individuals reshaped? Because there is this idea that we live in a country and there's upward mobility, and that if everybody else gets out of the way, and that we have a true meritocracy, that we could just work. If we work for it, we get it. And we could get it. It's just everybody else has to get out there and get out the way. And because I did it and my people did it, then you could do it. And there's parts of that, especially is particularly toxic in how that's playing out in terms of our messaging, in terms of our media. And there is no homogeneity in terms of that kind of experience, in terms of merit and so forth. So when it relates to the individual, so certainly we do. We pride ourselves in rights and freedoms. We vote with our pocketbook usually over collectivist values, but there's parts of that imagery that is incredibly toxic. And for the record, I think that the part of individualistic, toxic, and masculine culture, it has to be dealt with, right?
Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, be a rugged individual, and so on and so forth. Well, none of us is alone. We all depend on other people to help us and support us. No one can stand for himself or his own. It's just rubbish. Maybe we've had enough because I have to teach class, so.
Okay. I just want to thank you all for attending this forums, and I want to thank the college community just for their investment in not just during the presidential election season, but to civic engagement at large. I just really appreciate all of the efforts, not just in here, but in attending some of these wonderful events for undocumented folks, and DocuWeek, and initiatives like that that we're doing as a collective in the community just gives me so much hope. We would like to thank the office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and our dear colleague Kim Irvine for sponsoring this. So just thank you so much for your time.